Welcome everyone. Before we start the session, I would like to recite the Namokar mantra. Namo Arihantanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Ayaryanam, Namo Upchayanam, Namo Layesav Sahunam. Hello, Jai Janendra, and welcome everyone. This is another enriching session of ancient Jainism. Before we start, I would like to give you a little overview about ancient Jainism. Ancient Jainism is an initiative to spread awareness on Jain history, heritage, archaeology, literature, and other related aspects. For this, we keep on organizing online sessions which are open to all, and they revolve around interesting topics that cover fascinating aspects of the Jain world. We are very proud to inform that we have had the opportunity of hosting several eminent scholars and student researchers in the past. And to get regular updates, please follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel with the same name. Uh, and if you want the link, it is available. It will be made available to you on the chat box as well. For today's session, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Stephen M. Vose. He holds a PhD in South Asia Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, he is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Bhagwan Suparvashnath Chair in Jain Studies at the University of Colorado, Denver. A historian of Jain communities in Western India from the early Islamic period to the present, his work focuses on community formation and interaction with political powers. His first book, Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Jain Intellectual Culture and in the Delhi Sultanate, forthcoming on Routledge, is a recipient of the Edwards C. Dimcock Jr. Book Prize in the Indian Humanities, awarded by the American Institute of Indian Studies. Dr. Vose is here with us today to deliver a lecture. The Sultan who built a Jain temple, Muhammad bin Tughlaq in Jinaprabhasuri and afterwards. As the Delhi Sultanate Empire grew in the early 14th century, local communities had to configure their political and economic, social, and religious networks. The Khartar Gach monk, Jinaprabhasuri, narrated his meetings with Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq and his Vividhtirthkalp, depicting a mutually beneficial relationship that ushered in a new era of prosperity of Jains. The Sultan protected the Jain merchants, pilgrims, and Tirtha, and even built a temple in Delhi. Jain monks became a part of the intellectual life of the Tughlaq court. The story of their meetings would be retold many times over the following 250 years, shaping Shwetambar interaction with the Mughals. Drawing on his forthcoming book, Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Dr. Stephen Vose challenges two persistent and problematic themes in modern understanding of this period. One, that the Jains disengaged from political life with the advent of the Muslim rule in India. And the second, that Muslim rulers were hostile to Indian religions and Indian religious communities and destructive to Indian culture. Now, without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Vose to enlighten us on all the subjects. And for the speakers, I would like to tell if you have any questions or any doubts, you can type it in the chat box. We will take the questions later. Welcome, sir. I invite you to the floor and welcome you.
Thank you so much, Soumya. Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. That helps to give a lot of context for what I'll be talking about today. So as Soumya mentioned, the talk that I'll be giving today is based on my forthcoming book. Hopefully it'll be out sort of mid-year. And yeah, it should be available as an ebook in India, and then it'll come out in a paperback Indian edition probably in about a year. So hopefully it will still be relevant, but you know, the 14th century was a long time ago, so I guess it stays the same for all of us. All right, with that, I will share my screen, and as Soumya said, if you have any questions during my talk, feel free to pop them in the chat. I won't be able to see them while I'm showing the slides here, but we'll get to them at the end. You still look good? Okay, and yeah, please take note of my email address there. Feel free if you have any questions that pop up afterwards, you'd like some clarification on, or other questions you have, just feel free to send me an email. All right, just a little timeline to give us a sense of this period of history here and sort of the context in which we think of Islam as a political force in South Asia, right? As early as the 7th century, during the very period in which Islam was just getting started on the Arabian Peninsula, we have Arab traders moving from the Arabian Peninsula to parts of Western India, particularly Kerala, where the oldest mosque in India still exists, as well as in Kutch, in sort of the borderlands of what is now Gujarat and Pakistan. And there's some ancient mosques there. So, in fact, trade with the Arab world precedes Islam in South Asia. And so, as Arab traders and Arabs start becoming Muslims, they bring Islam to South Asia mostly through trade in that way. In 711, Muhammad bin Qasim conquers parts of what is now Sindh, and that's really the start of political rule by Muslims in the South Asia region. And of course, in the early 11th century, we have the now sort of famous and famed raids of Mahmud of Ghazni, um, yeah, who of course invades India several times, including most famously the 1026 sack of the Somnath temple. And of course, as many historians have pointed out, Mahmud of Ghazni wasn't really interested in building an empire in India. He was interested in raising money so he could go fight the Fatimids in Iran. However, that changes toward the end of the 12th century when Muhammad of Ghur defeats the Tomars in a city that comes to be known as Delhi and makes it part of the Ghurid Empire, which lasts until about 1206 when his general Qutb al-Din Aibak breaks away from the Ghurids after Muhammad dies and founds what we think of as the Delhi Sultanate, which is really a collection of a series of dynasties that rule from Delhi. More to the point of our discussion today, beginning in about 1297 to 1310, the Khaljis, this is one of the sort of the second main dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate, starts a campaign of conquest and empire building in Gujarat and sort of eventually takes over most of Gujarat by about 1310. They give way to the Tughlaq dynasty at about 1320, and we'll be focusing on Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who is the second emperor of the Tughlaq Empire, who reigned for about 26 years, 1325 to 1351. And it's during his reign that the Jain monk Jinaprabhasuri, who was a Kartargach monk, goes to his court and has several interactions with him that he records in his own works. All of this falls apart in about 1398 when Timur, sometimes known as Tamerlane, sacks the city of Delhi. And from that point on, the imperial sort of formation really fragments back into a series of regional sultanates, which carries through for about 150 years or so until the Mughal Empire starts back up again, particularly under Emperor Akbar, the Great, the famous, who kind of rebuilds the empire and conquers Gujarat again about 1576, 1572, something like that. But all of this, people often ask me why I do this work. And I've been sort of traveling to India for the last 25, going on 26 years now. And yeah, of course, like most historians, I think that we're often troubled by the way that the past is used as a political tool in every country by sort of every polity, but particularly now in certain ways. And so I'm often sort of inspired by this passage from Walter Benjamin's essay on the concept of history, that one of the last essays that he wrote was published in 1940. But he writes, to articulate the past historically means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. The same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. In every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. And as a recent example of this, just last year, there was a Gujarati film called Kasumbo, or The Safflower, directed by V. Bhava, that sought to portray the conquest of Gujarat by Alauddin Khalji in terms that actually cast the Jain site Shatranjay apparently as a Hindu temple. And so, yeah, really interesting ways that there's kind of grafting and merging Jainism and Hinduism for kind of political purposes in this film. And as we see, sort of politically speaking, recently, of course, Safflower. And of course, history writing done by European and American scholars hasn't really been absent of these kinds of prejudices either. In Saskia Kirthenboom's Nitya Sumangali, a book about Devadasis in Tamil Nadu, she writes this interesting passage, right, and sort of casts what I think of as kind of a general way that the history of this period has been portrayed in scholarship that actually has very little to do with really engaging in this period of time. And so it really shows how this version of the narrative has just come to be generally accepted in ways that statements like this get through peer review without really being challenged. And if you note the date of publication here in 1987, it's just about 4 or 5 years before the Babri Masjid was destroyed. And so she writes, in 1318, the Muslim invader of Delhi captured the Hindu prince of Devagiri, flayed him alive, and set up his head at the gate of his own city. This event illustrates the cruelty and ruthlessness that accompanied the conquest of the Hindu south by the Muslim forces of the north of India. With the ascension of Muhammad bin Tughlaq of Delhi in 1325, the massacre of Hindus and the destruction of Hindu culture increased. The threat of extinction of Hindu culture, religion, and law, she goes on and on. You get the idea. And so this idea of sort of cultural imperilment or cultural genocide has been sort of persistent in the ways that Western and sort of European and American scholars have written about this period of time, which actually made me chuckle aloud when I read this passage here from Barani's Fatawa al-Jahamdari, which is sort of a missive that expresses extreme annoyance with Muhammad bin Tughlaq for precisely the opposite reason from what Kirstenboom portrays about this emperor. So he writes, the Hindus are, and I use the macron over the oo there to demonstrate that he's talking about the geographic notion, right? Not a religious notion per se, although he does bring religion into this. The Hindus are held in the greatest respect and esteem and are honored highly. The Sultan confers on them responsible offices, including governorships of provinces, which we actually have example of a Jain having a governorship. He allows them to be furnished with the complete paraphernalia of greatness, that is, the kilat, the robes of honor. Thus, the Hindus enjoy all luxuries, employing Muslimans as their servants. They also carry on unrestrained and open propaganda of their books and disseminate their teachings, preferring Hindu philosophy to Islamic literature. So as we can see here, right, a history that was written in 1350, right at the tail end of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign, just as Firuz Shah, his successor, was taking over and trying to sort of mend fences with many of the sort of Persianate elites who were in Delhi, whom Muhammad had alienated. We see an attempt to sort of recast Muhammad bin Tughlaq as a great friend to Hindus and actually as an enemy of other Muslims in several ways. In fact, even Ibn Battuta says that Muhammad bin Tughlaq has spilled a great deal of blood, but almost all of it of other Muslims. All right. So this Jain monk, Jinaprabhasuri, who we'll be talking about today, and his work, who was he? So he was the acharya, or the head monk of the Lagu Shaka, or the sort of smaller branch of the Shvetambara Kartagat. And I think with this group, I don't need to explain that much further. He was of the Srimala caste from present-day Binmal, then of course called Srimal itself, in southwestern Rajasthan. And he was a prolific author, actually, probably the most prolific Indian author of any religion for his time, for the late 13th and early 14th century. He wrote over 100 hymns and roughly 30 other works, including works on grammar and Sanskrit poetics. He wrote numerous hymns that display many of the alankaras, or the ornaments of high poetry or kavya. He also wrote a ritual manual, which is still used today, called the Vidhimarga Prapa, including many other hymns to goddesses and other figures that are imbued with mantras. And so he was considered a great yogi as well, who had the control of these Vidya Devis. But his most famous work, which we'll be discussing today, is called the Vividhtirthkalp, or Chapters on Various Pilgrimage Places. That's actually a name that starts to appear in the manuscripts that were recopied starting in about the 16th and 17th centuries. At the very end of the text, Jinaprabhasuri himself called the text the Kalpa Pradipa, which I translate as the light on the age. And I have sort of a whole argument in my book about why I think that's a good translation for this title. But in short, what he's trying to show is that this is a great period of reawakening for Jain communities all over India where he has traveled. And to give you a sense of the extent of the Delhi Sultanate, this was about the extent of the Delhi Sultanate in about 1325, as Muhammad bin Tughlaq is taking power. This was the largest empire in South Asia since the Mauryan Empire, going all the way back to Emperor Ashoka. And yeah, had extensive territorial holdings. And the story I want to tell begins in a little city just northwest of Delhi, as modern day Hansi, which he calls Afinagar in his text. And it starts with a chamatkari, or miraculous image of Mahavira being taken from a temple. It's called the Mahavira of Kanyanayana. And the image is taken to the treasury in Tughlaqabad in Delhi. And currently, if you've ever been in sort of the southern lanes and gullies off of Chandari Chowk in Delhi, you go to Nowghatha Gully, there's a temple that claims to have this very image. This is not it, it's a stand-in. I have been trying to get a photograph of the real image for years and years. And if anyone happens to know the folks there at Nowghatha Gully and can get me a photograph for my book, I still have time to sneak it in. I'd be very grateful. So the image is brought to Tughlaqabad Fort, which you can go visit in Delhi. And one day, while Muhammad bin Tughlaq is holding court, he asked his Hindu astrologer, um, a man named Dharadhara, who the most learned person in the land is. And the astrologer pipes up and says it is Jinaprabhasuri. And he just so happens to be in Delhi at this time. So the Sultan invites him to court and welcomes him in, and the two kick off a series of meetings that end up creating a rather positive series of interactions for the Jains. Unfortunately, for historians of the Delhi Sultanate, there's not a lot of material evidence left, so we often have to go slumming it by using Mughal period documents. So this is a fragment from an invitation scroll that shows Emperor Jahangir hosting a Jain monk at his court, just to give us a sense of what we're looking at. And one of the ways that Jinaprabha hits it off really well with Muhammad bin Tughlaq, according to Jinaprabha, is that he delivers an ashirwad, a benediction of finely wrought verses, and then explains his verses that was so skilled and clever that the Sultan was exceedingly delighted and astonished. And the term there is chamatkariya, right? So his mind was sort of made into the same way that a miraculous image is. So this term chamatkari comes up over and over again in the Vividhtirthkalpa. And what comes out of that series of interactions is a number of firmans, or edicts. These were imperial proclamations that were meant to essentially give Jains safe passage around the empire and to protect such tirthas as Shatranjay, Girnar, and Palavardi. So if any of you have ever been to Merta Road, the Parshvanath there of Halodi, still resides in the temple. It's a very beautiful image and a miraculous one as well. There is, in fact, one firman left from the Sultanate period. This was issued in 1325 by Muhammad bin Tughlaq to a community called the Sevras, which Persian scholars and others have worked out seems to be a reference to Jains, whether it comes from Shvetambars, Shravakas, we're not entirely clear. Shrivaras has also been tried. Not exactly sure why they refer to Jains as Sevras, but that seems to be the fairly consistent term that's used, and it's used well into the Mughal period as well by figures like Abul Fazl, who writes Akbar's Chronicle. And a key passage from this reads the Sewadagan of Delhi, the Jains of Delhi, well known and reputed in their community, are great men and special disciples, which may mean that they have their own religion, and well wishers of people and of His Majesty, that is the Sultan, so that wherever they reside, they should not be harassed or made to show a fresh pass. Instead, they should be made happy with kilat, that is the robes of honor, and inam, other kinds of royal or imperial gifts. So we have a record here in this text that has been preserved by a Jain family. It is now in the Dallas Museum of Art. And so, yeah, very lucky that this has recently been translated. So as a result of Jinaprabhasuri's interactions with Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he gets several of these firmans protecting Jain's safe passage throughout the empire, protecting a number of pilgrimage places, including Shatranjaya and Girnar down here on the Saurashtra Peninsula. And in return for this, Jinaprabhasuri agrees to go down to Daulatabad, right, otherwise known as Devagiri, where Muhammad bin Tughlaq is trying to set up a second administrative center that is closer to the territorial holdings in the south. Here's what the citadel looks like. It's actually built up on a hill that has had the sides carved off of it to make quite a formidable citadel. Unfortunately, and as everyone knows, the water there isn't very good, and Jinaprabhasuri suffers from the bad water down there, and we hear about that later on in our story. In fact, we know that temple pieces of even Jain temples were made to rebuild mosques down there, and a lot has been made of that practice. And we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A, although I won't be really getting into that very much here. But as I mentioned, Jinaprabhasuri writes all of this down in this text, the Vividhtirthkalp, and the text is often considered part of the Prabandha genre. And so I just want to talk about this genre of text a little bit here so we have a sense that this is not just a one-off text and that it was a really important form of writing for especially Shwetambar Jains in the 13th and 14th centuries to try to make sense of this changing political climate. And so we have lots of narratives in these prabandhas about ostensibly historical figures, kings, poets who are kings like Sri Harsha, famous Jain monks going all the way back to Arya Rakshita, and of course famous Jain laymen who are some of whom are ministers to Hindu kings and even generals in armies. And as the texts often tell us, their interest is to tell stories that are temporally closer to the author's own time. Most of them are in Sanskrit, some are in Prakrit. In fact, the Vividhtirthkalp is in some of each. And they are of varying levels of poetic rendering. Some are in very beautiful and complex verse, some are in prose and fairly easy to read. And interestingly enough, many of them deal with the idea of the Kali Yuga or the Dushamakala as the reason for why things are going through this period of political upheaval, which is another kind of thesis I have in the book. And in fact, in a slightly earlier Prabandha text called the Prabandha Chintamani, or the Wishing Stone of Narratives, Acharya Merutunga tells us exactly why he has created or is participating in the creation of a new genre of literature. He says, because they have been heard ad nauseum, old stories, and he uses the word charitra there, do not please the minds of the wise so much. So I, that is Merutunga, am composing the book, the Prabandha Chintamani, with accounts of people who lived not far from my own time. And in fact, most of what's in that text are the narratives of famous Jain ministers, especially Vaktupal and Tejpal, I'm sure many of you know, and the Chalukya and Vaghela kings of what is now Gujarat. And so the Vividhtirthkalpa, which is right here, sits in the middle of a long period of Prabandha texts being produced in Western India, going back possibly as far as 1234. We have record of a text called the Prabandhavali by a monk named Jinaprabhasuri that was supposedly written for Vaktupala's son. And so we have other famous texts of Prabhavika Charitra, Prabandha Chintamani, and then the Vividhtirthkalpa in 1333, and then a few others after that, including the narrative of the restoration of Shatrunjaya, the Nabhinandana Jinodhara Prabandha, and the Prabandha Kosha, or Treasury of Narratives. So we see in this period a long sort of periodic rendering of narratives that are supposed to be about sort of recent historical events and figures. And as I argue in the book, I think this is about making sense of this period of transition. And these prabandhas continue on well into the 16th century. And I'll just highlight two of them here, the Upadesha Saptati and the Panchashati Prabodha Prabandha Sambandha. Both of these were written by Tapagach monks, and they're very interesting in that both of them retell Jinaprabhasuri's story and his narratives of meeting the Sultan, and they sometimes change his name from Muhammad bin Tughlaq to Firuz Shah. But the theme is that the influence of Jinaprabhasuri was able, on the Sultan, was able to sort of overcome sort of this uncertainty and lead to a new period of good relations between the imperial formation and the Jain community. Some of it facilitates trade and economic relations, no doubt. And some of it protects pilgrimage sites, allows the rebuilding of temples, and through which the sort of reinvigoration of Jain communities. So a little bit more about the Vividhtirthkalpa. It is about 63 chapters long, dealing with 48 different sites, some of which are pilgrimage places, some of which are cities that have chamatkari or miraculous images. About two-thirds of it is in Sanskrit, with about a third in two-thirds in Prakrit with a third in Sanskrit. Its chapters were composed over time, or between 1308 and 1333. And so this is actually interesting because Jinaprabhasuri tells us at the end of many of these chapters that he actually traveled to these sites, he composed these poems, he heard local traditions, he learned from other monks. So he's actually citing some of the sources where he gets his information. And it's finally sort of all compiled together. And for the longest time, I think scholars didn't quite know what to make of this text because it's a sort of a gathering of chapters rather than a coherent text. And so part of what I'm trying to look at is what are the consistent themes that come up in these various chapters that sort of help tie it all together. So some of these are eulogies and histories of the sites, right? They mention sort of miraculous figures and events. They mention the presence of certain types of deities, kshetrapals, right? Local divine protectors of these sites, the deeds of monks and kings, laymen, and a lot of discussion of the alchemical properties and substances that can be found at places like, especially Girnar, Shatrunjaya, and a few other places. Of course, he actually acquires a total of 6 firmans from the Sultan. And as I argue in the text in my book, right, counteracting the sort of deleterious or bad effects of the Kali Yuga is sort of the consistent theme. And he argues over and over again that it's through the efforts of the community that everything can be restored again. In fact, make things even better than they had been recently. And that's why I think he calls it the Kalpa Pradipa, right? The light of the age. All right. Just to give you one example of how he talks about tirthas in the Vividhtirthkalpa, I'll talk about the very first chapter of it, which is dedicated to Shatrunjay, which is probably the foremost Shwetambar pilgrimage site. Certainly, it's there on the Saurashtra Peninsula. If you've never been, here's a little shot of what it looks like. It's sort of famous citadel cities of temples up on top of Shatrunjay Hill by Palitana. And interesting that this always gets a lot of applause from Jain temple leaders here in the US who are constantly trying to get their communities to donate to the Temple Maintenance Fund. But he writes there in verse 55, there is 100 times as much merit or punya in installing an image as in doing worship, 1,000 times in building a temple, and endless times in maintaining a temple. And the term there, of course, is palana, which can also mean protecting a temple. And this theme of restoration, right, which he calls udhara, is a sort of a big theme with most of these tirthas here. So it's lifting up, drawing out, right, and this usually involves rebuilding or renovating Jain temples. And this sort of forms a kind of set list of sort of 17 famous restorations of Shatrunjay. And that list becomes fixed over time, as John Court points out in framing the Jina. Interestingly, he refers to recent historical events, namely, as he writes in verses 119 and 20, Phai Dik. In 1313, the image established by Javadi, one of the great famous Jain laymen of old, was broken by the Mlechas, the barbarians, due to the power of the Kali Yuga. In 1315, the good Samara Shah restored the main image. Right? In fact, he works, as we know, Samara Shah worked with Alt Khan, the local governor appointed by Alauddin Khalji, to restore the main image. And so he records this historical event in there and its restoration. And of course, another text that was written, actually one of the earlier Gujarati texts called the Sangapati Samara Simarasa, also detailed many of the events involved with the destruction and restoration of Shatrunjay. And interestingly, Jinaprabhasuri concludes his kalpa on Shatrunjay here by talking about the emperor, the Raja. And in undertaking this kalpa for him, the emperor has shown favor to the community. So from this victory, this kalpa should forever be known as the grace of the king, Raja Prasada. Very interesting here, like there's really only one figure who would qualify as Raja Adiraja at this point in time, so he must be talking about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, actually. And yeah, especially considering the other chapters in the Vividhtirthkalpa that detail his interactions with the Sultan, this seems to sort of fit in. He's referencing him. And in fact, those 15th century Tapagats tellings sort of take this verse and create an entire narrative of Jinaprabhasuri and either Muhammad bin Tughlaq or Firuz Shah Tughlaq going on pilgrimage together to Shatrunjay. And so really portrays the Sultan as a great benefactor and patron of the Jains. Okay, back to Jinaprabhasuri. So Jinaprabhasuri had been in Devagiri for about 3 years when Muhammad bin Tughlaq wishes to have a sort of debate settled, and he thinks the only person who can really help him settle this debate is Jinaprabhasuri. So he invites him back to Delhi. And as Jinaprabhasuri tells the story, it's an utsav, a mahotsav, every place that he goes along the way. It takes him about 3 months to get back from Devagiri to Delhi. And along the way, there's celebration after celebration on his trip back to Delhi. And actually, the narrative picks up in the Vividhtirthkalpa, but it's not written by Jinaprabhasuri himself. It's written by a junior monk whom he promoted to Acharya in a slightly different shaka of the Kartargach, a monk named Vividhtirthkalp, who tells the rest of the story, as it were, here. So Jinaprabhasuri retires to a life of teaching and consulting for the Sultan. And Muhammad bin Tughlaq makes this possible because he establishes a Jain quarter called the Bhattarika Sarai, or the sort of the district for the head monk here, the Bhattarika, in Delhi, complete with the upashray there for the monks to stay in full time because he's getting quite elderly at this point in time. He was in his early 70s. And he returns the image of Mahavir, that he had actually returned it back in 1328, but he has a new temple built to house this image there. And Vidyatthilaka is making a case within this text that Jinaprabhasuri should, for these purposes, be called the Yuga Pradhana, right, the leading monk of his age. And as he writes of the story of like how it occurs to Muhammad bin Tughlaq to do this, he says, then one day thinking, it must be tiresome for the Guru always to be coming here from so far away. The king gave him his very own brand new quarter, Abhinava Sarai, with beautiful buildings right next to his own palace. And he instructed the lay Jain community to reside there. And by the king himself, it was given the name Bhattaraka Sarai. And there the Patsha caused a temple to be built for Mahavira. This was on July 15th, 1332. And interestingly, in that same part of the text, he makes a very clever equivalence between the Sultan and the Suri. He calls the Sultan the Siri Sarvabhauma, right? The Sri Sarvabhauma, right? The blessed Lord of the whole world. And he calls Jinaprabhasuri the Suri Sarvabhauma, right? The Lord of all Suris, or of all monks, all head monks. And interestingly, he concludes saying, the Shvetambaras and the Digambaras travel in every corner of the realm without any trouble, holding in their hands edicts given by the emperor. And this is very interesting. This is one of the few times we see reference to Shvetambaras and Digambaras being really part of the same tradition, right? That the firmans acquired by Jinaprabhasuri applied to the Digambaras as well as to the Shvetambaras, not just the Kartargach, not just the Shvetambaras, but to the Digambaras as well. Very interesting moment where we see a reference from a Shvetambara to a Digambara that is not a polemic. And as I argue in the book, what we see here is not so much that Jainism is being sort of defined as a whole coherent tradition vis-a-vis Islam, but actually vis-a-vis the politics of a new kind of political dispensation in which, right, the Turkish, Central Asian descent leaders of the country now are now looking at Indian communities in different ways and sort of helping to galvanize a tradition here as a political entity. And interestingly, Jinnah Prabhasuri himself makes some really laudatory statements about Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Right? He says, having witnessed the elevation of the faith, right, the Prabhavana, done by Muhammad Shahi, even though it is the fifth age, the Dushma Kala, people carry on as if it were the fourth age, right, the Dushma Susama Kala, right, which is the period in which Mahavira and all the other Jinnas live and operate. And Vidyatthilaka says something that ends up sounding an awful lot like what Zia al-Din Bharani says as a complaint. But here he says, just as when the Hindus ruled, Himduarajay, as in the fourth age, so in the fifth age, during the rule of non-Aryans, Anajirajay, monks go about freely spreading the teachings of the Jinnas. Uh, I don't know that I would necessarily take this as corroborating evidence of Botany's claims, but it is interesting that the parallel exists there, right? That as he puts it, Botany puts it, right? The Hindus are allowed to just carry on open propaganda and they prefer their own Hindu philosophy to Islamic literature. And here we have the Jain monk saying, yes, indeed, like we are allowed to just go about freely spreading our teachings. So I find this sort of a really interesting way to think, not so much about historical events, but about historical rhetoric. And that's really where I want us to leave here, right? I don't necessarily know whether we can ever verify that all of the things that Jinaprabhasuri says in the Vividhtirthkalpa are necessarily true and factual statements. But what's interesting to me is that they are true in the sense that he is trying to get the Jain community of his time to think differently about their current moment, right? And seeing that this leadership has sort of galvanized Jain communities all over by restoring these sites, right? And that's sort of investing in this period. That the calamity of conquest and the political upheaval of the time is sort of gone by a generation, or maybe half a generation. But that we're settling into sort of a new and prosperous period for people. And as we think about how we want to portray this period, I'm certainly not trying to sugarcoat conquest, right? conquest is always horrific. It upends people's lives, and it creates new political dispensations. And so the reasons for power certainly is things that we can, right, sort of talk about, debate, decide whether this is a better kind of political dispensation than ones that we have now or not. But one of the things that is made clear through this text, and through the way that this relationship is portrayed is that this could be compelling to a reader. And so this isn't just so far out of left field that people would have just rejected it in its own time. Clearly, it was an extremely influential text. We have Tapagach monks retelling this story over and over again for the next 2.5 centuries as their gacha is taking over political power, and sort of edging out the Kartargach for power, especially by the time Emperor Akbar comes into play. Right, of course, we have Vividhtirthkalp, right, the famous Tapagach monk who has a very long-standing relationship with Akbar. Of course, Jahangir was mentored and taught by Jain monks, as we know, had a very complicated relationship with them. But this was a very effective set of sort of political discourses that really shaped the way that Jain leaders continued to think about and think through how representing the Jain community to our new Muslim sultans and eventually the Mughals um, was going to be, right? So they used Vividhtirthkalpa and Jinaprabhasuri as a platform on which to think about political leadership of the Jain community and the role that monks ought to have in that. All right, I've talked for a long time here. I really appreciate your patience and I thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to seeing the questions that I've been sort of noting pop up here in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this detailed discussion and the presentation that we had. We do have some questions. Some of the our participants have noted down. So the first question about the Jain religious establishments constructed by the Sultan. Do we have any surviving archaeological evidence that we can refer to?
From the Sultanate period,
Yes.
yeah, inscriptional evidence is somewhat hard to find for the restoration of temples and images, and that is largely because temples continue to be renovated throughout this period of history. So, you're right, the idea of sort of historical preservation of things wasn't necessarily sort of on the forefront of everyone's mind prior to the modern period, and so frequently, as temples got renovated, inscriptions would be lost. So we're sort of what we have really prior to the Mughal period is sort of a very incomplete record of archaeological evidence. In terms of where, say, the Batatika Sarai might have been, unfortunately, most of the area around Tughlaq and around the thousand-pillared temple has been extensively built over. And so I don't know that we have very much archaeological evidence for where this sort of Sarai, this quarter of Delhi, might have been. Yeah. And it's very interesting to me that the temple in Noghata Gully sort of highly touts that this image of Mahavir is the
Mhm.
one from Jinaprabhasuri's Vividhtirthkalpa. So I don't necessarily know what to make of it. It sort of fits the description of the image in the text. It says that it's made of marble and moonstone, and when it's struck with the fingernails, it resounds like a fine bell. And there is a really interesting kind of patina to that Mahavir image there. It's sort of like got a nice sort of brownish hue to it. And so, yeah, I don't know exactly sort of the history of sort of what happened in the 17th, 18th, 19th century that led the Jain community to sort of see this image and continue to see this image as the one that was given back to the Jain community from Muhammad bin Tughlaq. But yeah, I would love to learn more about this actually.
Definitely. Thank you. There is another question. What could have been the dynamics behind the glorification and appreciation of some sultans and emperors, so much so that they have written eulogies by the monks in the medieval period? Like, what were they trying to secure for themselves or the community or the religion as such?
Yeah. Essentially, two things. One, safe passage for Jains throughout the empire, and two, the protection of places. So, right, we get reference to course, the big tirthas, Shattrunjay and Girnar, always get referenced. And then
Mhm.
we get reference to certain towns and cities like Asinagar, now Hansi, Falodi, or the Phalavarti Parshvanath. So they are interested in making sure that these sort of temples that are built in these market towns are also protected. And part of this it has to do with sort of the long, sort of hotly debated issue about like why were temples destroyed, why were images destroyed and plundered. Of course, part of the whole idea of temple destruction is a political act. If we take Richard Eaton's thesis as sort of probably one of the more compelling theses for why temples were destroyed. If we actually look at where and when they were destroyed, most of those temples that were destroyed, but during, say, the period of conquest in the Deccan and farther south by the Tughlaqs, were temples that were politically relevant to the local ruling powers. And so, actually, that was fairly in keeping with, say, sort of the demonstration of conquest between Hindu kings prior to that. So the sultans were engaged in politically meaningful symbolic actions through temple destruction in a way that would be legible to local people to show that the local king had been displaced and his Shri or his sort of royal power was gone or dissipated. Plundering images. Images were always sort of objects of fascination and sort of were brought into treasuries and collections. We have record of this in the Mughal period as well. And of course, sort of the expediency of if you need to build a mosque in a place, it's so much easier to do it with pieces that are already there rather than quarrying new, fresh stone. And so part of what we think about as sort of cultural patrimony or belonging to all Hindus or all Jains in that period of time really would have been seen as belonging to the elites who built those things. And so when we think about, say, the destruction of, what is it, the 27 or Hindu and Jain temples to build the Quwat al-Islam Mosque in Delhi, for instance, right?
Mhm.
Those were temples that were already located within the citadel of the fort. So those were already politically relevant temples. And so, right, rather than think about this as an attempt by Islam or Muslims to destroy Hinduism and Jainism by cultural destruction, what it really was political displacement of a new ruling dispensation, showing that the old ruling dispensation had been cast aside. And as I often tell my students, like, what is a king's job other than to either like defend his territory or lose his head? So yeah, as we think about this, like in our modern cultural terms of cultural patrimony and these things, right? That's where some of this kind of heated feeling comes up, I think, and sort of gets
Definitely.
exploited by some politicians more than others. But if we think
Yes.
about it in the context of sort of political and symbolic action, I think that sort of helps tone it down a little bit. And
Because
so
we are
that's really where
seeing,
I,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, because we are seeing, like in the narrative that has been building today, that they portray it from a very malicious intentions behind these destructions, rather than understanding what you are saying, that it was more of a political act, and which has been happening everywhere. Like if even if we talk about Jerusalem for that matter, the whole conquest that happens there and the destruction of the walls and everything is is something similar, if I'm not wrong.
yeah. I mean, certainly the Romans in 70 AD when they knocked down the Second Temple, right, and forced the
Yes.
diaspora, right, of the Jewish people there was because of a series of rebellions that had happened there. And there's even been some a thesis put out by a few scholars of Islam, mostly European scholars of Islam, who want to point out that building the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in many ways, the Muslims saw that as the restoration and the building of the Third Temple,
Yeah.
that they were actually restoring the covenant with God in an expanded framework. Yeah, really interesting ways that we often overlook these kinds of things.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah.
One last question. How much of the information given in the Vividhtirthkalpa can be relied upon to be like absolute truth, or like truth to a larger extent? Or are these exaggerations or interpolations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was something that early on in my readings of this, I would go and talk with my professors about this, and they're like, look, if you're going to try to like corroborate every fact that gets asserted in the text, you're probably going to drive yourself mad. And so, right, there are a few things where we have multiple texts talking about the same event. And so it seems likely that the event happened, whether it happened in exactly the way that one or another text told it,
Hmm.
Probably not,
Hmm.
right? Right. So the idea of sort of like fidelity to factuality was like rarely the motivation in which people wrote things. Right. The idea of sort of the modern notion of history where you sort of sift through documents and try to come up with an objective telling of like what really happened is probably not on their minds. So what I started thinking about was my history isn't so much a history of fact as a history of rhetoric. And what I was really interested in is why did Jinaprabhasuri write this text? Right. And like to try to answer that bigger question, all I could try to do was to think about what would make this text compelling to right an ideal reader. So say a Jain merchant in Delhi who regularly travels to Gujarat and Rajasthan, who traces his roots, right? His watan, his native place is somewhere in the region, right? What would have made this text compelling, right? If he's asserting certain kinds of things happen, like, right, the Patataka Sarai got built with a new temple,
Hmm.
right? A Jain in Delhi could easily go and verify that fact is either true or not,
Hmm.
right? Whether things happened at Shatruಂಜಯ and Girnar or not. Um, certainly we would be able to tell if those temples were restored or not, and right being able to read that this was the effort of right Samar Shah, right, a Jain layman working with Alt Khan, right? Those are some of the details that may or may not be known. But what would have been the purpose in narrating it in this way? Right? And I think part of this has to do with the case for Jinaprabhasuri being the Yuga Pradhana, being the leading monk of his age. And so certainly there's that kind of rhetorical effort to demonstrate how much leadership Jinaprabhasuri had really done for the Jain community, how it reached beyond just his sort of sub branch of the Kartagach to a wider framework, right, including Shvetambras and Digambras. And so, right, as a matter of fact, right, what we have is that we know that this was compelling to Jains because they kept talking about this for another 2.5 centuries.
Definitely. There is one question by another scholar, Jain scholar. He's asking, and he's curious, if you can compare the relation of Jinaprabha Suri with Muhammad bin Tughlaq vis-a-vis Hira Vijaya Suri with Akbar, or the relation of the
Yeah,
two, or the relation of the two Gacha with the respective Muslim sovereigns. I mean, the attitude of the Tapa Gacha towards Muslim sovereigns notably changed with Hira Vijaya. So, do we have similar parallel in the Khatar tradition? I hope
yeah, that's a
I
fantastic.
put the question across right.
Yeah, this is from Anchit Jain.
Yeah,
Yeah. Great question. This is really what made this so compelling to me is we have this story that was sort of told and retold by Tapagach monks throughout the 15th century. And what's really interesting, there's a Tapagach monk by the name of Dharmasagara, who was, as far as I can tell, kind of Hira Vijayasuri's hatchet man until he went too far, and he gets excoriated for this. But Dharmasagara writes a polemic against the Kartargach, and one of the things he goes on and on about is Jinaprabhasuri and how he was not a good monk because he had compromised his vows to go chasing after the Sultan. And of course, you can't trust a Kartargach monk anyway. They don't even understand proper Jainism. And that Kira Vijay Suri is going to be the new benchmark for how a good and observant monk interacts with a sultan in Akbar. And so it is really Dharmasagara who deals the kind of death knell to using Jina Prabhasuri as the kind of political imaginaire platform for thinking about how monks ought to interact with sultans. In fact, Dharmasagara gets reprimanded for this, partly because of the things he says about Jinaprabhasuri, but more pointedly, he criticizes the Tapagach monks who told stories of Jinaprabhasuri in laudatory terms. And so Dharmasagara seems to have overplayed his hand here. And Paul Dundas writes about this in his History, Scripture, and Controversy book, his History of the Tapagach. So I reference that in my book too. But yeah, Paul's work is really what pointed me to this.
okay.
Great question.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. I just have one personal question, and it's not academic because I'm not myself a historian or an academician. Like we have one of a comment by Meenu Jain ji. She says, I hope whatever your work is and your book is, it helped de-radicalize the minds of the present day Jain community who see the history as a history of invaders and something that stood against their culture and values. So, how do you see your book in this perspective, in today's political perspective, which is leaning towards this sort of narrative?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, this is, when I started graduate school, I had no intention of writing a book that was about sort of defusing the fraught notion of what Muslims did to Jains in the past. And even while I was researching and writing this, I didn't really have that much of an intention to do it. But as you know, I finished my dissertation in 2013, and I realized I've given a lot of public talks about this research and books over the years, and I've been sort of slowly updating pieces of this as I turn this into a book. And it's just like clear to me that there are like people who are very reluctant to want to listen to my portrayal of this period, because they seem to say that I'm just trying to portray a rosy image, that I'm cherry picking my sources. I've been criticized for a lot of things about this. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is a statement that was made by a scholar about this period of time, talking about the curious and ominous silences of the historical record of why Hindus and Jains didn't write more about the Upadravas, the sort of calamities wrought upon them by Muslims. And I remember pausing at one point and just thinking, if we talked about silences in the historical record, what we would actually call that, if we were talking about any other less politically and emotionally charged topic, we would just call that a lack of evidence. And so maybe by considering the fact that there was a much more complex and complicated set of relations between leading monks and our sort of political leaders of the time, who were sort of using all of their intellectual wherewithal to sort of bring in the Jains into the political conversations, that there were motivations for different emperors at different times to work with Jain and other Hindu communities. Certainly, the more we read of history, the more that I think that temperature gets brought down on these kinds of conversations. I mean, one of the most curious things, of course, is that Alauddin Khalji, right, who is often seen and portrayed as a sort of bloody, ruthless, mindless Muslim who is sort of out to effect a genocide, raised a mostly Hindu army to keep the Mongols out of India, right? So most of the foot soldiers in that army were not Muslims; they were Hindus. And so the whole idea of this being a pitched battle between Islam and Hinduism and Jainism, I guess, on this other side here, really just doesn't hold up to any serious scrutiny of the historical record. And what we have is sort of a much more complex set of social and political relations here. Now, the thing we ought to get upset about is, should we have the political dispensation in which violence is sort of the thing that negotiates all of our relations? And I would always say no to that. But right, as we think about sort of how important our religious identities are to us today, there is actually a history to that very idea too, right? That goes through the colonial period into the present. And when we look into the past, people didn't always slice their pies up that way, and that they thought of their identities as right different kinds of things. As I often tell my students when we're learning Gujarati or anything, right, the idea that "Un Jain Chu," I am a Jain, is a very modern statement. And when you read older Gujarati texts, right, what you would hear is somebody say, "Hun Jina Dharma Manuchu," right? I follow Jina Dharma, right? Communities are certainly there, right? We know that communities were there, but the idea that your religious identity is intrinsic to your being and not something that you commit to following is actually a pretty modern idea.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to invite one of our fellow scholar, Ocean Jain, to present a vote of thanks for your great lecture. Welcome, Ocean.
Thank you.
First of all, I would like to say a huge thank you, sir, for accepting the invitation of Ancient Jainism, for agreeing to deliver this lecture on a sultan who built a Jain temple, Jinaprabhasuri's Vividhtirthkalp, and afterwards. Usually, any scholar who is working in the field of Jain studies, they treat Vividhtirthkalp or Kalpa Pradeep as something which is very interesting. It gives a lot of data, but in this way, in this perspective, which you have seen, Vividhtirthkalp and its interpretation, in understanding the dynamics of the medieval period, how the Jains were trying to manifest themselves in the form of Jinaprabhasuri, and how their relations have been highlighted with the Sultan, and how Sultan has been represented in the perspective of the Jains. That's a very interesting thing to be learnt about today. It's also because in today's scenario, as we all are very much aware, the politicians and the other scenarios, they try to create a kind of a gap between the two communities, and that actually creates a lot of disputes in the present society. These kinds of works which the academicians are doing through their academic reviews of such primary texts, that actually brings us a lot of new perspective of fresh data of looking at our own history. So instead of one history, you have tried to bring to us multiple histories, I would say. So thank you very much. We are very thankful to Professor John Coates, sir, an eminent Jain scholar who has also been present for this particular session. I'm also thankful to Saurabh Jain and Soumya, who are always detrimental in bringing out wonderful sessions for all of us. Thank you all participants, and thank you, sir, so much again for agreeing to deliver this lecture and for making it a huge success. Thank you, sir.
Dhanyavad.
To all our participants, I would like to inform that the recording of this session will be available on YouTube in few days. So those who have missed it can connect there again. Thank you so much, sir. Would like to hear from you again later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. And please, I put my email in the chat. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me.